At 8:0247 a.m., the radar signature of the USS Abraham Lincoln crossed an invisible boundary that existed on no public map. Iranian operators monitoring the northern Arabian Sea registered the movement instantly. The carrier had entered what military planners on both sides referred to by different names, but understood identically: the kill zone, the space where Iranian missiles could reach American ships, the space where warning time collapsed from hours to minutes, the space where the mathematics of modern warfare became terrifyingly simple. Inside, hardened command bunkers scattered across Iran's southwestern provinces. Alert status elevated without announcement. This was not the first American carrier to operate in these waters. It would not be the last. But the context surrounding this particular deployment transformed routine presence into something far more dangerous. Tens of thousands of Iranians lay dead from the regime's crackdown on protests. The world was watching. And the President of the United States had made threats that no one could dismiss as bluster because he had already proven 7 months earlier that he would act. The Lincoln moved through water that concealed history. These shipping lanes had carried oil tankers for decades, feeding the engines of global commerce. They had also carried warships, submarines, and the silent machinery of confrontation that defined the relationship between Washington and throne since 1979. Every mile of this ocean had been studied, mapped, and gamed in simulations that both navies ran continuously. The Americans knew Iranian missile ranges to the meter. The Iranians knew American defensive capabilities to the second, and both knew that the margin between deterrence and disaster had never been thinner. On the carrier's flight deck, crews worked in darkness, illuminated only by red lights that preserved night vision. FA-18, Super Hornets sat armed and fueled in their spots. F-35C, Lightning II. Stealth fighters, the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal, waited in the hangars below. EA-18G Growlers loaded with electronic warfare pods capable of blinding enemy radar had completed their pre-flight checks hours earlier. The air wing was ready. The question was whether it would be needed. Somewhere beneath the surface, at depths and distances that remained classified, attack submarines tracked alongside the carrier group. These vessels carried Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets 1,600 kilometers inland. They also carried torpedoes designed to destroy anything underwater that approached the formation without authorization. The submarines never surfaced. They never transmitted unless absolutely necessary. They simply watched, listened, and waited. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers formed the visible perimeter of the strike group. The USS Spruant held position to the north. The USS Michael Murphy guarded the south. The USS Frankie Peterson Jr. operated somewhere in the formation, its exact location shifting according to threat assessment. Each destroyer carried vertical launch cells loaded with missiles capable of intercepting aircraft, drones, and incoming ballistic weapons. Each represented a defensive layer that any attacker would have to penetrate before reaching the carrier itself. But Iran had spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operated hundreds of fast attack boats armed with anti-HIP missiles. The College FR's ballistic missile with a range exceeding 300 kilometers had been designed specifically to target American carriers. The Cater cruise missile could skim the surface of the water at near sonic speeds, evading detection until the final moments before impact. And the drone swarms that Iran had developed, tested, and supplied to proxies across the region represented a threat that no navy had ever faced at scale. The kill zone was not a line on a map. It was a probability field where the chances of successful Iranian attack increased with every kilometer closer to shore. At the outer edge, American defensive systems held overwhelming advantage. Radar coverage overlapped. Reaction times remained comfortable. Interceptors could be launched with confidence. But as distance shrank, those advantages eroded. Iranian land-based radars could track the carrier more precisely. Coastal missile batteries could achieve faster lock. Drone swarms could be launched in quantities that saturated defensive capacity. The closer the Lincoln ventured, the more dangerous its position became. Inside Iran's Air Defense Command structure, the order propagated through encrypted channels with unmistakable clarity. Red alert, all systems active, all crews at stations, all protocols accelerated. The phrase carried weight that extended far beyond the personnel who received it. Red alert meant the system had transitioned from monitoring to engagement readiness. It meant authorization chains had been shortened. It meant decisions that normally required minutes of verification could now be made in seconds. The Bavar 373 surface-to-air missile system, Iran's indigenous answer to the Russian S-300, activated its phased array radar across multiple sites. The system could track dozens of targets simultaneously and engage threats at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers. It had been deployed specifically to defend against American stealth aircraft, though its actual effectiveness against F-35s remained untested in combat. The regime claimed capabilities that Western analysts doubted, but doubt cuts both ways. American pilots approaching Iranian airspace could not afford to assume the system would fail. Older systems joined the defensive network. S-200 batteries dating from Soviet designs but upgraded with indigenous Iranian technology swept the sky with long-range radar. Tor M1 mobile launchers repositioned to protect high V-value targets. The 15th Chord system deployed to contested islands in the Persian Gulf provided point defense for facilities that any American strike would need to suppress. Layer upon layer of defensive capability overlapped, creating what Iranian commanders called an integrated air defense umbrella. The islands themselves represented a critical component of Iran's strategy. Greater Tunba, Lesser Tuni, and Abu Musa sat in the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz like fortresses guarding a narrow pass. Iran had militarized these positions over decades, installing radar, missiles, and fast boat shelters that could launch attacks on any vessel transiting the strait. The Lincoln would not enter those confined waters. No American carrier would risk the geometry of the Persian Gulf when Iranian missiles could reach from multiple directions simultaneously. But operating in the Arabian Sea still placed the strike group within range of Iran's longest-reaching weapons. The calculation that both sides performed continuously was brutally simple. Could Iran sink an American aircraft carrier? The answer was probably not, at least not with any single weapon system or coordinated strike. The defensive capabilities surrounding the Lincoln were designed to intercept threats that no other navy could deploy. Aegis radar systems could track hundreds of contacts. Standard missiles could engage ballistic weapons in their terminal phase. Close-in weapon systems could destroy drones and missiles in the final seconds before impact. The carrier itself, with its armored flight deck and compartmentalized hull, could absorb damage that would lesser vessels. But the question missed the point. Iran did not need to sink the carrier to achieve strategic effect. A single missile penetrating defenses and detonating against the hull would create a political earthquake. Images of an American warship burning in the Arabian Sea would transform regional calculations overnight. Allies who depended on American protection would question their assumptions. Adversaries who feared American power would revise their estimates. The psychological impact of even limited damage could exceed the military significance by orders of magnitude. This understanding shaped behavior on both sides. American commanders operated with extreme caution, not because they feared defeat, but because they could not afford even the appearance of vulnerability. Iranian commanders operated with calculated aggression, not because they believed they could win, but because demonstrating willingness to fight carried its own deterrent value. The result was a continuous dance of positioning and signaling where every movement carried meaning that had to be interpreted correctly to avoid catastrophe. On the morning the Lincoln entered the kill zone, Iranian state television broadcast footage of missile tests conducted weeks earlier. The images showed Carter cruise missiles launching from mobile platforms and striking target ships in the Gulf of Oman. They showed ballistic missiles descending from altitude and impacting with precision that Iranian spokesmen described as meter-level accuracy. They showed drone swarms coordinating attacks that overwhelmed point defenses. The broadcast was not news, it was communication. The message arrived in Washington exactly as intended. American intelligence analysts cataloged every frame comparing claimed capabilities against observed performance in previous conflicts. The Houthis in Yemen had used Iranian-supplied weapons against commercial shipping and American warships for over 2 years. Their anti-ship ballistic missiles had struck vessels. Their drones had evaded interception often enough to force fundamental changes in defensive doctrine. What Iran's proxies could do, Iran itself could do better. That reality informed every decision made aboard the Lincoln. General Mohammad Pakpour, commander of the Revolutionary Guard ground forces, had issued his warning days earlier with language chosen for maximum impact, finger on the trigger. The phrase evoked imagery of a weapon already aimed, requiring only the slightest additional pressure to fire. It suggested that Iran's response to any American action would be immediate, automatic, and overwhelming. It warned against miscalculation, which in military parlament meant both accidental escalation and deliberate provocation. Supreme Leader Khomeini had reinforced the message with his own declaration. Regional war, the threat expanded the frame of potential conflict beyond bilateral exchange. It promised that any American strike would trigger responses across multiple theaters: Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen. The entire network of Iranian-aligned forces that had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment would activate simultaneously. American bases, American allies, and American interests throughout the Middle East would become targets. The kill zone was not merely geographical, it was conceptual. The space where American power could be challenged without inviting annihilation. The space where Iranian resistance could impose costs without achieving victory. The space where both sides existed in a state of mutual vulnerability that neither could escape through firepower alone. Aboard the Lincoln, sailors who had never experienced combat understood this reality intuitively. They performed their duties with the precision that training demanded, but they also felt the weight of circumstance pressing down on every action. The carrier had participated in strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities 7 months earlier during the 12-day war. It had launched aircraft that dropped bombs on targets inside a nation of 90 million people. Now it had returned to waters where the consequences of that history remained unresolved. Iran's air defense operators felt similar weight. They had watched their country's nuclear program set back by years in a single night. They had seen senior commanders killed by weapons they could not intercept. They had experienced the humiliation of failure that the regime had tried to mask with claims of victory, but that everyone understood for what it was. Now they sat at consoles tracking an American carrier that had participated in that humiliation, wondering whether they would be ordered to respond if the attacks resumed. The red alert status imposed physical and psychological costs that accumulated with every hour. Crews who should have been resting remained at stations. Equipment that should have been cycled through maintenance continued operating at maximum readiness. Commanders who needed time to think found themselves reacting to every blip on every screen, because the next contact might be the one that mattered. Sustained alert is itself a form of combat, one that degrades capability even as it demonstrates resolve. American forces faced similar strain. Flight operations continued around the clock, launching surveillance aircraft that monitored Iranian positions while themselves being monitored by Iranian radar. Destroyers maintained defensive postures that required constant vigilance against threats that might materialize without warning. Submarine crews operated in conditions of silence and isolation that tested human endurance. The strike group could sustain this tempo for weeks if necessary. But every day added friction that no maintenance schedule could fully address. Neither side wanted war. Both sides were preparing for it. This paradox defined the confrontation in ways that no external observer could fully appreciate. The sailors aboard the Lincoln did not wake each morning hoping to launch strikes against Iran. The operators at Iranian air defense consoles did not wish for American aircraft to appear in their engagement envelopes, but wishes did not determine outcomes. Circumstances did, and circumstances had placed both sides in positions where a single miscalculation could transform preparation into action. The kill zone existed because physics made it inevitable. Missiles have ranges, radars have detection thresholds, aircraft have combat RADI. These parameters create zones of effectiveness that overlap in predictable ways. Where American offensive capability met Iranian defensive capability, the kill zone emerged. It was the space where the carrier could strike Iran. It was also the space where Iran could strike the carrier. Mutual vulnerability made concrete in kilometers and coordinates. What happened next depended on decisions that had not yet been made. Would Trump order strikes that his military had prepared but not recommended? Would authorize responses that his commanders had rehearsed but not executed? Would some incident, some misidentification, some accident trigger escalation that neither side intended but both had created the conditions to enable? The Lincoln held its position in waters that had grown familiar through decades of similar deployments. Its crews performed duties that generations of sailors had performed before them. Its aircraft flew patterns that traced paths worn into the sky by thousands of previous flights. Everything was routine except the context. In context, in moments like this, determined whether routine became history. Iranian air defense remained on red alert. American strike aircraft remained armed and ready. Submarines tracked contacts that might be threats or might be fishing boats. Radar swept horizons that might reveal nothing or might reveal the beginning of something that could not be stopped once started. The kill zone was not a place where killing was certain. It was a place where killing became possible, where the mathematics of modern warfare reduced the distance between intention and outcome to seconds rather than hours, where the decisions of individuals operating under pressure that no training could fully simulate would determine whether families received messages of safety or notifications of loss. And in that space between preparation and action, between capability and restraint, between the steel of American warships and the concrete of Iranian bunkers, history waited to learn what would happen when the trigger that both sides held was finally pulled or finally released. Because the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is not the explosion. It is the silence before the explosion, when every system is ready and every human is watching, and every second carries the weight of decisions that cannot be undone. The Lincoln remained in the kill zone. Iran's air defense remained on red alert. And somewhere in the space between them, the countdown continued without a clock anyone could see.